I want to set a couple of parameters here for this. I am not actually a huge fan of where I'm afraid foreign policy might go for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. I think they're a little more isolationist than I am. I am not a globalist. A lot of dumb people can't nuance anymore. I think America leads the world and needs to lead the world. However, I also completely understand J.D. Vance's concerns, having fought in Iraq. He has seen a different perspective on our use of the military and what we can and cannot do. I do tend more and more to think in hindsight, our incursion into Iraq and our extended stay there did a lot to undermine our own faith in our mission in the world. And I think that our position on the world stage has made a lot of Americans tired. But I also think our leadership of the world has allowed Europeans to become lazy. And I also think that there is an elite in the world filled with elite opinion that has convinced itself Russia is the problem with everything. And they can't see their nose through the fog of their own talking points at this point. Russia is not our friend. Russia is our enemy. They are in alliance with China, which is also our enemy. And there is this global axis growing on the world stage that does wish to undermine our position in the world. When you call it an axis of evil, people who got tired of the Iraq War begin to immediately dismiss you, when the fact of the matter is that it is very obvious to everyone paying attention that China and Russia and North Korea and Iran and Venezuela and Cuba, South Africa, and a number of other countries are aligning right now to take over the world and to make it their world order and to supplant the United States. And I do think that there are a lot of people in the Trump administration who have decided that there is no point in us continuing to lead the world. We'll just carve out our space. And it's not going to go well for them. At the same time, I think a lot of Europeans have gotten very lazy. Look at Germany. Germany is a country that regulates, it does not innovate. Germany is a country that has so invested in the new left talking points on the environment that it has wound down its capacity to be self-sufficient and hoard itself to Russia. Yeah, I choose my words carefully there. It has hoarded itself to Russia. Without the Russians, the lights will not stay on in Germany at this point. And it is worth, yet again, pointing out to everyone that I do think that Donald Trump has made a great point to Europe that it's got to be able to stand itself up instead of being dependent on us for its long-term security. I understand the Europeans think every time they're dependent on each other for security, a world war breaks out. There's a balance there. But part of the concern in Europe is that the elite in Europe have become so detached from the concerns of the common middle-class, working-class person of Europe that they're seeding distrust themselves in their own government. So this is J.D. Vance saying something that got a lot of people bent out of shape, but he was telling the truth.
Now, we're at the point, of course, that the situation has gotten so bad that this December, Romania straight up canceled the results of a presidential election based on the flimsy suspicions of an intelligence agency and enormous pressure from its continental neighbors. Now, as I understand it, the argument was that Russian disinformation had infected the Romanian elections. But I'd ask my European friends to have some perspective. You can believe it's wrong for Russia to buy social media advertisements to influence your elections. We certainly do. You can condemn it on the world stage even. But if your democracy can be destroyed with a few $100,000 of digital advertising from a foreign country, then it wasn't very strong to begin with.
He's not wrong. J.D. Vance is not wrong. I do think he's a little dismissive of the concerns in Romania about the Russians, and I do actually think the Russians have been working very, very hard in Europe to stir up dissent and populist and popular fronts to try to put sympathetic Russian parties in power. I do think that's a real thing that I think J.D. Vance is too dismissive of, but I also think that the Europeans are not playing their cards properly, and J.D. Vance's point is if you can up in an entire democracy with some digital advertising, your democracy isn't strong to begin with. Maybe you need to work on your democracy. And that's part of the problem with Europe is they haven't been working on their democracy. The elite in Europe despise the working class and the middle class. The elite in Europe, remember, most of the elite in Europe were all socialists. They were all sympathetic to the communists. It's kind of wild that they're the ones upset about Russia. They do not like the concerns of the working class and middle class. They think they're a bunch of racists. They bitterly despise the base of voters in their countries. The elite wish they did not have to have democracy, and that has made democracy weak in Europe. A little more here.
No voter on this continent went to the ballot box to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants. But you know what they did vote for? In England, they voted for Brexit. And agree or disagree, they voted for it. And more all over Europe, they're voting for political leaders who promise to put an end to out-of-control migration. Now, I happen to agree with a lot of these concerns, but you don't have to agree with me. I just think that people care about their homes, they care about their dreams, they care about their safety and their capacity to provide for themselves and their children. And they're smart. I think this is one of the most important things I've learned in my brief time in politics. Contrary to what you might hear a couple mountains over in Davos, the citizens of all of our nations don't generally think of themselves as educated animals or as interchangeable cogs of a global economy. And it's hardly surprising that they don't want to be shuffled about or relentlessly ignored by their leaders. And it is the business of democracy to adjudicate these big questions at the ballot box.
Now, one more clip from Vance to put this all in proper context. And you should know he really ruffled the feathers of the German counterparts who criticized Vance for saying what he said. One more here.
Europeans, the people, have a voice. European leaders have a choice. And my strong belief is that we do not need to be afraid of the future. You can embrace what your people tell you, even when it's surprising, even when you don't agree. And if you do so, you can face the future with certainty and with confidence, knowing that the nation stands behind each of you. And that, to me, is the great magic of democracy. It's not in these stone buildings or beautiful hotels. It's not even in the great institutions that we have built together as a shared society. To believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. And if we refuse to listen to that voice, even our most successful fights will secure very little. As Pope John Paul II, in my view, one of the most extraordinary champions of democracy on this continent or any other, once said, "Do not be afraid." We shouldn't be afraid of our people, even when they express views that disagree with their leadership. Thank you all. Good luck to all of you. God bless you.
Now, I just want to point out to you that in Europe, the poor, the working class, the middle class really despise European immigration policies, and it has led to the populist movement. What is going on and what gets overshadowed is that the birth rate of most European countries has collapsed. And the European leadership decided that they could bring in immigrants from Africa and the Middle East to replace their workers because they needed new workers in their factories. What they did not do was cause assimilation. There are, frankly, parts of Stockholm and Paris and Berlin where a white person cannot safely go. The police tend to avoid them. They allow local mosques, for example, to control the area. It's not safe. There was another terror attack in Germany today, another Afghan plowing into a crowd of people. The actual voters in these countries are rebelling against politicians who decided the voters were replaceable because they didn't see the voters as voters, they saw the voters as workers. It's part of the backlash in our country to Common Core. And the elite just keep changing the name now. It's the Singapore model for math now. It's not Common Core, among other things, but it's the same thing. The people decided they didn't like the educational systems in this country, and the elite just decided they hated the people. And they're going to force you into failing schools. The Democratic elite don't want you to be able to go to the schools that their kids go to. They keep you in failing schools. And there's promoted and prompted a voter backlash. Same thing is happening in Europe. The European elite despise their voters. They don't like innovation. They're scared of new ideas. They prefer to regulate than innovate. They don't like digital economies. They don't like access to information. They absolutely despise freedom of speech. In Great Britain now, if you make a critical remark of Islam, you can go to jail. If you call a man, but the man insists on female pronouns, you can go to jail. They don't value freedom of speech. They don't value it because increasingly the voters are actually speaking out against immigration and speaking out against ethnic minorities who have refused to integrate, and it's causing problems. And the elite in Europe would rather scream, it's Russia doing this, it's Russia doing this. They cannot look themselves in the mirror and recognize that they have failed, and they have become scared of their voters because they chose to look at their voters as cogs in a wheel who were replaceable by people from abroad. What we are seeing is the collapse of a European internationalist project, and it's given rise to a populist movement. And yes, Vladimir Putin is pouring money into the populist movement because he does believe it will help him beneficially in Europe. And yes, I do think that our administration in this country is not paying attention to or does not care enough about what the Russians are doing. At the same time, I do think the Europeans need to listen to J.D. Vance. He's not wrong here. The European leadership has caused its own voters to turn against them, and Vance is warning them. And part of the issue is free speech. And part of the issue is he's right. If your democracy can be undone by a few $100,000 in digital advertising, your democracy is not very strong. And it's not J.D. Vance or Russia that weakened Europe's democracies. It's the European elite who chose to ignore their voters and treat them as replaceable worker bees. That's on them, not on J.D. Vance. And if you're an American journalist or you're an American conservative, if you're an American liberal and you're mad at J.D. Vance for saying these things in Europe, you should be mad at the European leadership for failing their people for so long.